The landlord gave June Harper 3 days to leave. Not because she had done anything wrong. Not because she owed him money. He simply wanted the land. Winter's coming, he told her. You can't afford this place anyway. June stood on the porch of the little farmhouse where she'd lived for 6 years. Behind her were 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, 3 sacks of flour, a mattress, and everything else she owned. She looked at the man. Where am I supposed to go? He shrugged. That's not my problem. 3 days later, June was standing beside the road with her belongings piled onto a borrowed wagon. She had $23, a battered cooking pot, a handsaw, an old hammer, and one stubborn idea. She wasn't going to leave the valley. June had learned early that winter didn't care whether you were rich or poor. Snow buried everyone. Wind tore at every roof. Cold found every crack. But June understood something most people didn't. You didn't need a beautiful house to survive winter. You needed a place that worked. And after losing her farmhouse, she decided to build one. Not a cabin, not a barn, a shelter. The idea came from an old piece of agricultural equipment she'd seen behind a scrapyard. A curved steel frame, half buried, like an enormous metal rib. June remembered seeing similar structures used for storage. They were ugly, cheap, strong, and easy to cover. She walked to the scrapyard. The owner looked at her. What are you building? A shelter. For what? Myself. He laughed. June didn't. She pointed toward the pile of discarded metal. How much? The owner shrugged. $8. June counted her money, then handed him 8. She bought 3 curved steel sections. They were rusted, bent, ugly, perfect. June hauled them to the edge of an abandoned field. Then she started digging. She chose a shallow depression beside a hill. The hill would block the worst northern wind. The depression would let her bury part of the structure. She dug drainage trenches first, then placed heavy stones along the foundation. She bent the steel frames into position. One by one, the curved ribs formed a narrow Quonset-style shelter. June covered them with salvaged boards, then old canvas, then tar paper, then another layer of canvas. Finally, she packed earth around the lower walls. It wasn't pretty, but it was becoming strong. Her neighbor, Walter Crane, watched from across the field. You planning to live in that? June tightened a rope. Not yet. Walter laughed. Good. June looked at him. I'm building storage first. For what? Firewood. He shook his head. Why build a whole shelter for wood? June looked toward the mountains. Because wetwood doesn't burn. That was the part nobody understood. June had survived enough winters to know that firewood wasn't just fuel. It was time. If the wood stayed dry, she could heat water, cook food, melt snow, warm herself, dry clothes. A dry woodpile could mean the difference between discomfort and disaster. So she designed the shelter around ventilation. Openings at both ends. Raised wooden racks. A sloped floor. Drainage channels beneath the wood. The steel roof kept snow from touching the pile. The canvas walls blocked wind-driven moisture. And the earth packed around the base kept the temperature from swinging wildly. Walter inspected it. You thought this through. June smiled. I had to. By October, the Quonset shelter was finished. June moved her firewood inside. She stacked it carefully. Not against the walls. Not directly on the ground. She left narrow air gaps between the rows. Walter watched. You're leaving space. Air needs somewhere to move. He nodded slowly. How much did all this cost? June looked at the shelter. $8 for the steel. And the rest. Mostly things people threw away. Walter smiled. You might be the cheapest builder in the county. June laughed. I prefer practical. Then came the first snow. It fell for 2 days. The valley turned white. June checked her woodpile. Dry. The second storm came a week later. More snow. Stronger wind. The canvas held. The drainage channels remained clear. The wood stayed dry. By December, snow covered the entire valley. The Quonset shelter looked like a low metal hill. But inside, the firewood remained perfectly dry. June began bringing small bundles into her cooking shelter. Each piece caught fire immediately. No smoke. No sputtering. No wasted fuel. She smiled every time. Then the weather changed. A bitter wind arrived from the north. The temperature dropped to -24 degrees Fahrenheit. The valley's biggest problem wasn't the cold. It was moisture. Snow blew sideways. Roofs disappeared beneath drifts. Barn doors froze shut. Several woodpiles became soaked. People began burning damp timber. Chimneys smoked. Fires struggled. June watched from her doorway. Then she heard pounding. Walter stood outside. His coat was covered in snow. June. She opened the door. What happened? My wood's soaked. He looked embarrassed. I can't get the fire going. June glanced toward her Quonset shelter. How much do you need? Walter hesitated. Enough for tonight. June grabbed her lantern. Come on. They entered the shelter. Walter stared. The firewood was dry. Every piece. June handed him an armful. He touched the wood. It's dry as summer. That's the idea. Walter looked around. Could I bring some more tomorrow? June smiled. Bring your own cart. The next morning, 3 more neighbors arrived. Then 5. Their wood piles were wet. Their barns were leaking. Their sheds were buried. June opened the shelter. But she had one rule. Take what you need. A rancher stared at her. You're giving it away? Winter doesn't care who owns the wood. They carried bundles home. June watched them leave. She didn't realize yet that her little $8 shelter was about to become much more important than a place to store firewood. That afternoon, the sky turned black. Walter rode back toward June's property at full speed. He barely dismounted before shouting, June! She ran outside. What? He pointed toward the northern mountains. A wall of white was moving toward the valley. That's not another storm. June stared. The clouds seemed to reach the ground. Walter's face had gone pale. It's the worst one they've predicted. June looked at her Quonset shelter, then at the woodpile, then toward the homes scattered across the valley. She understood. The firewood wasn't the only thing that needed shelter, and the storm was already coming. The storm arrived before sunset. The sky disappeared behind a wall of gray. Wind tore across the valley so hard that June had to lean against the farmhouse door to keep from falling. Walter shouted from the yard, Get inside. June looked toward the Quonset shelter. The steel ribs groaned. But they held. She ran to the shelter and checked the canvas. One corner had begun to pull loose. June grabbed rope. Walter followed. Leave it. Not yet. Together, they fought the wind. June climbed onto a wooden platform while Walter held the ladder. She tied the canvas tighter, then drove a second stake into the frozen ground. The shelter stopped moving. June climbed down. Now we go. They hurried toward the farmhouse. Within an hour, the valley disappeared. Snow flew horizontally. The temperature plunged to minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit. Every sound became muffled. Then came the first crash. A barn roof collapsed somewhere beyond the trees. Another followed. Walter looked toward the darkness. My barn. June didn't answer. She already knew. They couldn't stay in the farmhouse. The wind was pushing snow beneath the doors. So June grabbed blankets, lanterns, and food. Where are we going? Walter stared at her. The shelter. June opened the Quonset door. Inside was completely different from the world outside. The wind became a dull roar. The temperature was still cold, but manageable. The drywood was stacked along raised racks. June moved several bundles to the center. Walter looked around. This was never just a woodshed. No. June pointed toward the back wall. She had installed a small stove months earlier. Beside it were water barrels, blankets, canned food, and tools. Walter smiled. You planned for this. I planned for winter. By midnight, 7 neighbors had arrived. Some had lost barns. One family had lost the roof of their house. Another had spent hours trapped in a shed. June opened the shelter to everyone. Children slept beneath blankets. Adults sat near the stove. The dry firewood burned steadily. No one complained about the cramped space. They were alive. Then someone shouted, There's another family outside. June grabbed a rope. Walter stood. I'll go. June shook her head. We both go. They tied the rope between themselves and stepped into the storm. The wind nearly knocked them over. They followed the fence line. 20 yards. Then 10. Then they found the family. A man. His wife. 2 children. Their wagon had overturned. June pulled the smallest child against her coat. Pulled on. They tied everyone to the rope. Then began the slow journey back. Halfway there, the wind shifted. The rope went tight. Walter fell. June grabbed him. Get up. I can't see. Then follow my voice. He rose. They kept moving. Finally, the Quonset door appeared through the snow. People inside pulled them in. The door slammed shut. Everyone was safe. The storm lasted 3 days. For 72 hours, the valley remained buried. But June's shelter held. The steel frame didn't collapse. The drainage system prevented flooding. The raised wood racks kept the firewood dry. The ventilation openings remained clear. The stove burned continuously. The shelter became a tiny island of warmth in a frozen world. And the $8 June had spent on those discarded steel ribs suddenly seemed like the best investment anyone in the valley had ever made. On the fourth morning, the wind stopped. Silence replaced it. June opened the door. Sunlight flooded the valley. Everything was white. Barns had collapsed. Fences were buried. Trees had snapped. Roofs were damaged. But the Quonset shelter stood exactly where it had been. Its curved steel frame was buried halfway in snow. Its canvas was torn in 2 places. But inside, the firewood was still dry. Walter walked inside. He picked up a piece. Unbelievable. June smiled. Not really. He looked at her. $8. She laughed. $8. The neighbors helped repair the shelter. They replaced the torn canvas, strengthened the doors, cleared the drainage channels. Then they started building their own. Some copied the curved steel frame. Others used timber. A few dug shelters into hillsides. Nobody laughed anymore. They had learned something. A winter shelter didn't have to be beautiful. It had to work. When spring finally arrived, June received an unexpected offer. The county wanted her to teach other homesteaders how to build low-cost winter storage shelters. June agreed. She showed them how to use discarded materials, how to raise wood off the ground, how to create airflow, how to protect against snow, how to build drainage, how to make a small shelter serve many purposes. But she always emphasized one thing. Don't build for the winter you hope to have. She pointed toward the mountains. Build for the winter you pray never comes. By the following autumn, more than 20 shelters stood across the valley. Every one contained emergency firewood, food, water, blankets, tools, and every shelter had a simple rule posted above the entrance. Take what you need. Leave enough for the next person. June's original Quonset shelter remained the largest. People called it the $8 shelter. Tourists eventually came to see it. They expected something impressive. Instead, they found a small curved structure half buried beside an old farmhouse. June always laughed when they asked how much it had cost. $8. Then she'd open the door. Inside, the firewood was still stacked neatly on its raised racks. Dry, ready, waiting. Years later, when another brutal winter struck the region, the valley didn't panic. Every family had prepared. Every shelter had supplies. Every woodpile was protected. And nobody had to learn the hard way what June had known from the beginning. The strongest thing she built wasn't the steel frame. It wasn't the canvas. It wasn't even the shelter. It was the idea that survival becomes easier when people prepare together. June had been thrown out with almost nothing. $8 had been all she could spare. Yet that tiny investment protected her firewood, sheltered her neighbors, and eventually changed how the entire valley prepared for winter. She never rebuilt the farmhouse she had lost. She didn't need to. She had built something better. Something the storm couldn't take away. A place where the fire stayed dry, the doors stayed open, and nobody had to face winter alone.